Good evening, everybody. In deference to our guest this evening, this plenary session will take place in English. First of all, I would like to welcome our speaker this evening, Vesna, Vucinic, Neskovic. I think I've got the names right. In Portugal, we have to practice these Serbian names because Benfica has got so many Serbian players in the front line, we will have to get used to it. Vesna is our guest today because the idea is to illustrate another sense in which we can speak of anthropology in counterpoint. Anthropology in counterpoint, as I have mentioned before, is something that we can talk about in terms of the relationship between anthropology's various voices, how they combine together to form a whole. And as we saw in the previous moment, the whole need not necessarily be marked by harmony. In polyphony, it is also possible for there to be difference and dissonance. In this particular case, we would have to remember that the contrapuntal nature of anthropology is also a question of the relationship between different anthropologies to each other and between each different anthropology and mainstream international anthropology. Now, each of us in Portugal or in Brazil is accustomed to thinking about the way our anthropological tradition relates to the dominant international mainstream, and to think in terms of center and periphery, in terms of hegemony and wishes for counter-hegemony, in terms of anthropology, in terms of a relationship between the center, the whole anthropological framework, and the particular space within it that we occupy. What we tend to forget is that each different periphery within this global anthropology has a different relation to the center. And that if we want to understand how anthropology is a polyphonic phenomenon, to insist on the metaphor, we should also think about how the different peripheries relate to one another in the way that they relate to the center. And it's in that sense that it seemed to make a particularly good point in the context of this Congress to have a plenary session in which it would be possible for us to learn something about the way a peripheral anthropology, which we are not familiar with, has related to the center. And we've chosen to do this by inviting a very distinguished anthropologist from Southeastern Europe, who has her own very special and peculiar relationship both to Southeastern European anthropology and to the center, to tell us something about how she entered anthropology and how she has experienced the relationship between center and periphery. Southeastern Europe in this context is a special case. Those of you who are familiar with John Davis's book on Mediterranean countrymen will perhaps remember his description of an unkind description of how Western anthropologists sometimes enter anthropology departments in the Balkans and are suddenly confronted by Taylorian professors who, he says, like Japanese corporals in the Pacific, are still fighting theoretical and ideological wars that only they think still exist. If we think about peripheral anthropologies, all of us have an inheritance from the past. In the case of Portugal, we have the notion that anthropology in some way provides a key to the ethnogenealogy of the nation and provides us a key to national identity. In the case of Brazil, anthropology had a role in defining the official ideology of Brazil as a multiracial society. In Southeastern Europe, anthropology has also had a role in defining nationhood, ethnicity, and there has been a very strong emphasis, as in Portugal, on popular traditions and how someone brought up in that background has learned to relate to the international tradition is something that presents many implicit parallels to the experience, at least of those of us who live in Portugal, and possibly of people who live in other traditions. Vesna is Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Ethnology and Anthropology at the University of Belgrade. She was active during a decade in the International Association for Southeastern European Anthropology, INASIA, I think it's called. INASIA. And she has recently become a member of the organizing committee of the World Council of Anthropological Associations. She has, therefore, from her initial starting point in Belgrade, in Southeastern Europe, begun to be active in the framework of world anthropology, and is therefore particularly well placed to tell us about this relationship. It's a relationship that she has also explored through her own research. She has done research on Southeastern Europe, and she will be telling us about this, but also, and this is something that, as she will explain to us, put her in the international framework. She conceived a desire and an interest in doing research on cities in China. Now, for someone from Southeastern Europe to do research on cities in China, I imagine, was not very usual. And that research project took her out of the initial Southeastern European framework and into the international framework. It is in the relationship between these two that we have one more illustration of how anthropology can be thought of in terms of the relationship between the part and the whole as part of a polyphonic and contrapuntal symphony. Thank you very much, Vesna.
Thank you, Robert. This was such a great introduction. You said almost everything. Well, before I start my presentation, which will be done from that place over there, in order to use the PowerPoint, I would just like to thank the organizers of this conference, primarily Robert, who communicated with me about giving this keynote lecture, for inviting me. I must say that this was a surprise, really, and a great honor. And I was really also happy to actually see that this idea of the world anthropologies is actually going somewhere and being realized, because it really is unusual that an anthropologist from Southeastern Europe, from a small country like Serbia, is invited to a country on the other side of Europe, or South Europe, that there is also a wish to share some common past and maybe present experiences. I must also say that this preparation for this presentation for me was very emotional. As we talked about me preparing basically a autobiographic and informal presentation, I started off by really kind of digging through my past and trying to see what it is that brought me to where I am now. So that entails also certain images and events and processes that were happening during my childhood, growing up, going to the university, graduate school, and so on. You must remember that I'm a child of socialism, in a sense, and that as a grown-up I entered the experience of post-socialism. Now, I will start by actually an inspiration that has to do with the title of the conference, which was very, very inspirational for me, and something that I found out about things, water bodies, let's say, that associated, that I had associations about connecting anthropology. But for that, I'll go over there. So, as you've probably seen in the program, this is the title of my lecture. But yes, I just want to say that it does maybe sound pretentious. I like the offbeat. That could mean many things, but I just wanted to say by it that my let's say, entry into anthropology and into interest for China was somewhat unusual, and the whole education that I got was unusual for those times in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, when I was growing up, which was, let's say, from 1962 onwards. On the other hand, I kind of basically did in anthropology what I like to do. It seems that somehow when I analyze my past, I didn't really listen to my advisors much. I didn't really have a true advisor. I didn't really let myself be influenced by the mainstream theoretical streams, even though they splashed me, but somehow I was kind of swimming in between. This is how it seems to me. What I want to say at the very beginning, and concerning the music that you heard, and the first picture that you saw here, it actually has to do, as I just said, with something I learned about a river, and actually the piece of music that you heard that I didn't know about before. As you probably recognize, this was Vltava, the second poem of My Country, composed by famous Czech composer of the 19th century, Belgic Smetana. And even though I know this piece for years back, I only now heard the full description of the images represented in it. I realized that Smetana combined the scenes that represent the natural, the human or the cultural, and the supernatural domains. He describes the flow of Vltava from its two sources to their juncture, through the forests and fields, alongside a village in which a wedding takes place, close to the rocks at which the sirens dance in the moonlight, by the castles, palaces, and ruins, through the narrow rocks, in order to broaden and flow through Prague, and finally disappear at the confluence with Elba, a river that continues to flow through Germany and into the North Sea. Now, of course, I knew that the basic things, you know, the flow from the small stream into the confluence and the North Sea, but I didn't know about all these images that actually inspired him to compose different pieces of this body of music. And that actually invited me to think about this, the nature, the ontological nature of anthropology, and that is that it is probably, if I'm not wrong, the only social science that deals with the cultural, the natural, and the supernatural. On the other hand, this same river and the music made another association, which is, let's say, more political, in a sense related to politics of anthropology, and that is that what the basic idea of a world anthropologist is, and that is that we should, all anthropologists individually, and also different institutions, nationally defined, regionally defined, should be able to kind of, as these small streams come into a big river, and make this river powerful and more heard in the community of social anthropologists, and even wider in the society. So this was an easy way out to start the presentation. As you know, it is usually hard to conceive how to start it and how to combine all that you want to say in one place. I'm sure that I will not be doing it in an ideal way, because I did conceive it as an informal presentation. On the other hand, I will have some digressions into how Serbian anthropology grew, and probably try to make a parallel as to what was happening to a Portuguese ethnology and anthropology, as far as I could understand it from talking to my friends and colleagues. Anyway, this presentation will basically comprise two parts. Childhood, growing up, the start of the academic education, university and master's degree. This I want to stress because this is where China comes in. And then basically two of my further research projects. One was done in Dubrovnik on the spatial behavior in the old city of this town, and the other on the revival of religious festivities in the Bay of Kotor, Montenegro. So the first part starts with my home city. I won't talk too much about it because it will take time, and I just want you to kind of learn about me from the images and a little of the text that I put above. So, as you can see, Belgrade is well positioned on rivers Sava and Danube. This is the view to the old city and the Kalemegdan fortress, which stems from the Roman times. This is a pretty night view onto the old part of the city. And this is looking across to the new Belgrade, which was conceptualized and realized from the Second World War onwards. So these are some images from my childhood that I feel that strongly influenced me. One of the things was that I lived in a part of Belgrade which was full of parks, and parks of different kind, very wild as well. And we had these daily walks with my grandparents, especially in the morning and in the afternoon. This is one of them. Then there was occasional visit to the central Belgrade Park, the Kalemegdan Fortress, the one you saw just a minute ago. Then weekend visits to the tomb of the unknown soldier, which was built before the Second World War, but was a very beautiful place in the nearby Mount Avala, which was then visited by many Belgraders at the time. Then birthday celebrations and family gatherings on traditional holidays. At that time, of course, celebration of children's birthdays was the main thing to do. But my family also gathered within the family circle for traditional religious holidays. So basically, as we could already read in other socialist countries and communist countries, it is not that everybody gave away the traditional holidays. And so we gathered for Christmas, for Easter, and for the Slava, which is a particularly Serbian holiday devoted to the saint protector of the family. Now, of course, the difference from the earlier times, pre-socialist times, was that we did not invite guests. Basically, we celebrated, and most people celebrated it in their homes with the closest family. Another thing that influenced my growing up was the countryside landscapes in Srpske Moravice, Croatia, the village where my father was born in. They migrated to Belgrade in 1941 when the Ustaše were gathering the Serbs and putting them into concentration camps. And then the countryside life, this is behind this old house, which we still own, and in the woods with my mother. Again, some images that were, coming from the other side of the world, from my dad's travels, when he went to the States for his specialization in surgery. So I remember impressed by the New York skyscrapers and the Maya pyramids. So I think inside he was actually a hidden anthropologist. He just wouldn't admit it. As the time was going on, and it was the time of my starting elementary school, but just in this period, there was something that left a big mark on our family. In 1969, just after this picture was taken in the Texas Heart Institute in Houston, where my father was learning heart surgery, he went to Biafra. He joined the International Red Cross in the fall of 1969, and as you probably remember, there was a war going on from 1968 to 1970, where Biafra was one of the regions was trying to separate from Nigeria. It was a complicated war, but I can't go into details. Anyway, he went with the Red Cross team to a town in Biafra. This is the hospital where he was head of, which, as you can see, is quite well organized. There's a moment of Mrs. Ojukwu, the president's wife, the wife of the Biafran president, visiting the hospital. The operating room, which you can see is quite well equipped in that hospital in the Kigwe. Now some pictures of kids that had the Kwashiorkor syndrome, but also mainly of those who were not in such a bad shape, because in that particular time the hospital also was a center for food provisioning. So they were waiting in lines, but they did obviously get food on a regular basis. At least the inhabitants of the town. Now the hospital was also treating the war wounded. The critical moment came during an offensive by the federal forces on Nigeria, and a tragedy for the International Red Cross team. The rowdy federal soldiers who surged into the village one early morning started shooting just out of the blue from a few meters distance, killing 4 out of 10 Red Cross team members, 2 English missionaries who actually lived and helped the African people for 2 decades before that, killing 4 out of 10 Red Cross team members, 2 English missionaries, 1 Serbian doctor, my father's close friend, and 1 Swedish team member, and wounding 3 people, 2 Swedes and my father. These are the survivors. Now the 2 gentlemen on the right were not touched because while the soldiers were bringing them out of the bunker, which was an improvised thing, they succeeded in hiding and not coming out. 3 of them did that. The other 7 came out, and this is what happened. My father is the one with a nice white cap on his head. He hardly survived, but he did so because he threw himself onto the ground just when the shooting started. So the 2 bullets basically kind of went, wounded him, but it wasn't fatal, of course. And this is the Swedish team member who he treated right afterwards. Somehow they were then helped to leave the town again by the federal soldiers, who then realized supposedly that they were belonging to the Red Cross. Anyway, this was a big shock for all of us, especially also afterwards when my father came back, and when I remember the young wife of his friend who was killed came to our house and was asking, well, how did it happen? You stayed alive and my husband was killed. Anyway, the elementary school started, and we became the Tito's Pioneers. This is not my school class. I don't have a picture from that time, but I found another one which was exactly the same. And this initiation ceremony for us kids was always taking place on the Day of the Republic, which was the November 29th, which had to do with the history of the revolution, the Communist Revolution and Second World War. And you can see Tito and his wife always being somewhere with the pioneers. Just to use this opportunity, because I won't be coming back to that, I later on avoided becoming the member of the youth, socialist youth, and I also avoided becoming a member of the Communist Party. Not that because I was just somewhere else, but on the other hand, even if they asked me, I wouldn't have done it. I want to say again, not many people did belong to the party. Of course, that was the elite. Even now, if you take it, in China, there is only about 20 to 30% of the population being the members, so it's always the elite which had to be chosen in a certain way, and none of my family members was. Anyway, the 7th grade of elementary school came, and I was sent to Pittsburgh to stay with my far relatives who were Serbs. This was already the 2nd generation born in the US. At that time, many Serbs from former what it used to be Austro-Hungarian Empire migrated to the US, especially to Pittsburgh because of the steel mills and the coal mines. But I will tell a little bit more about that later on. So this was a 1-year experience there. But the idea was my father's. He was kind of the ideologist of our educational politics, my sisters and mine. So basically his idea was that we should learn good English, and later on you will see what his idea was about China. So when I reached high school, I moved with the school and went to an elite high school in the middle of the city. I was still playing the piano that I started in the elementary school, and I started learning Chinese. This was in about 1977, so 3rd year of high school. The idea here was that my father thought that China will become a great power. And since he didn't want his daughters, and this is what my both parents agreed on, because my mother was a doctor as well, but not so engaged in such hard work as surgery, that medicine, at least in the way that my father did it, is not for the girls. So he wanted us to do something much more pleasant, and he saw, this combination of knowing the word, leading word language well, and entering the Chinese studies, the language, would be a good career path. In a way, I mean, he wasn't oppressive about it, but he just came up with this idea. And he went to the Chinese embassy, which was again unusual, and he told them about this, and he asked them if they could send 2 Chinese professors to hold lessons for me at home. So these guys were quite surprised, but they did it. So 2 Chinese lecturers, who were actually official professors sent from Beijing to teach at the Belgrade University, started coming over. That lasted for about a month, not longer, because I guess, it was something completely unusual. They were not used to it. It was funny. They were holding classes always in 2. One was giving a lecture. The other one was sitting there in the same room, listening what the other one was telling, and then they would switch. But this was a good start because I got a good accent, good tones on my syllables. Now, this was the time when Serbia, when Yugoslavia, which they called now Salafu, was very popular in China. The primary reason was that the first Western film that they saw in China was the Yugoslav film called Walter Defends Sarajevo. It was a film that had to do with the Second World War, with this great hero, Walter, here in the middle, who has his group of partisans who, do all these diversions with the Germans and so on. Now, this was about the time also when the Cultural Revolution was dying out. As we know, it basically died out completely after Mao's death, and just before, of course, or with the start of the reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping and the new leadership. So there were no more rallies. I just couldn't resist to show you these pictures. There are maybe too many pictures, but I'm sorry. I just like them. So there were no more rallies in Tiananmen Square as there used to be, and then the countryside side. No more educational classes in between and at the end of the work time in the fields. No more Mao's red books. So, this is how I started with Chinese. And then came the senior year of high school, again in the US. The idea was that I should reinvigorate my English and, learn it on the high school level, and that it will be a fun experience, which it was, of course, because I went through all these things that a typical, American girl would do in this time of, in the senior year of high school. Anyway, this is Pittsburgh, of course, which is a beautiful city, although it for a long time, the bad image dragged on of the steel mills and so on. And this is the township where I lived in the South Hills. Now, these were these typical things. I joined the volleyball team. I, had a locker in one of these high school corridors which always looked the same. And I went to the shopping mall, which was very exciting at that time, which we didn't have, of course, in Yugoslavia. Then there was a general fad for Steelers and Penguins. My Serbian family had season tickets, and I went with them sometimes. And then I started also receiving some letters. This is now how I got closer to anthropology. Letters from Central America written by my neighbor, the ethnology professor in Belgrade. She was sending me these very interesting letters about her experiences traveling in Central America, and that really captured my attention. And then I attended an introduction to cultural anthropology course at the University of Pittsburgh in the second part of my year in Pittsburgh, and this is where I finally decided anthropology is for me. So, by the time of my return to Belgrade in the summer of 1980, a new period started both for me personally and for the whole country politically. Yugoslavia entered the period of late socialism. So, what were the things that were characteristic for this period? President Tito died in May 1980, leaving behind him a collective body to rule the country. The self-management which started basically in 1950 was unraveling. The influence of Yugoslavia in the non-aligned movement, which was then again started in 1972 by a conference in Belgrade, was becoming weaker. And the 1976 constitution, which gave much more autonomy to the republics and the new autonomous regions of Serbia, they were only initiated in Serbia, has started to act towards stimulating disintegration of the country. So basically, you know, these were the old images now already, and all of these. Tito was a lifelong president, so through his career he met many, for example, the US presidents, Soviet presidents, and presidents of other countries. I put this together because Yugoslavia had a very good relationship and understanding and help in various ways from the US, from the Soviet Union, and of course was very active in the non-aligned movement. So Tito, as you can see, met with all these dignitaries who later on came to his grand burial. We didn't have any more, you know, president who would be well, participating in occasions and putting out this image of a really cool guy. And this was a typical scene, and a scene that marked the previous times. That is the 25th of May celebration of the Youth Day. That was also pronounced to be Tito's birthday, which actually it wasn't. But anyway, there was a big thing going on around there because a batoon was made every year with different design and carried through the whole of Yugoslavia. Pioneers were carrying it, and then in the end, a big celebration in one of the stadiums was organized. At the evening of his birthday, one young lady or man would approach and give it to him, and this was the end of the ceremony. This is the picture that is from the last of his birthday celebrations when he was alive, 1979, and this girl is an Albanian girl. So this is kind of an interesting symbolic thing relating to what happened afterwards. Now, my intellectual self just before enrolling to university. Basically, you can summarize all this that you already saw. So it was what I want to stress is that basically I had the experience of Yugoslav socialism, of American capitalism, and I was also introduced to the way of thinking and the concepts of the Orthodox Chinese communism, which I mentioned here because we were using at the time the textbooks that were made in that time, and of course through language and through the contents of these texts that we were basically learning from. I picked up all of that, and then in the end the cultural anthropology course at the University of Pittsburgh, which gave me a background in American anthropological traditions with its division into 4 sub-disciplines and so on, everything that goes along with that. So basically I was initiated into anthropology in this, well, relatively short one course, but it was American anthropology. So university time comes next, and then afterwards the master's program at Harvard University. This is my university in the central Belgrade. You're invited to come. It would be nice if you visited and let me know about it, because the city is nice and the university is good. Anyway, this is the point where I will take a little time to explain about the history of ethnology, just in very reduced way, because it would take much more time. Anyway, of course, once we came to enroll in the first year, we started also learning about the history of our discipline. We had a certain course on it, and you could say that at the time the ethnology was starting to be initiated or formed. There were 2 major intellectual figures present. One was Vuk Stefanović Karadžić and Dositej Obradović. Now, one represented the Romanticist tradition, what was called afterwards, and the other one the Enlightenment tradition. Now, in this whole kind of struggle for for many things that were happening in the state, in the society, in the cultural ambience. We should remember that at that time, Serbia was under the Turks. And actually, the movement against and for liberation started. So this was also very, very important in this whole thing. To cut the story short, the Romanticist tradition actually won in what became ethnology. Serbian Romanticism was founded on the following principal assumptions. Every nation is characterized by a particular Volksgeist, and thus it is by the richness of its Geist, or it's troublesome to translate it, but maybe we can translate it as spirit, that the contribution of every people or the folk to the treasury of humanity should be measured, and not by the role it had in the making of political history. Second, that the Geist is not distributed equally among all the members of a community. Peasantry, the simple folk, is the principal possessor and guardian of the Serbian Volksgeist, and that the people's spirit also expresses itself primarily in language, but also in various forms of popular culture, and particularly in oral folk literature and folk customs. Thus, they have to be meticulously written down and preserved, for it is on them that the culture of a nation should be founded. And this is what Vuk Karadžić originally did. He was a philologist and a collector of folk traditions. But this went on. His followers were basically, but in another way, also founders of anthropogeography and ethnology in Serbia. I'm now mentioning only the main people, but there were some others, of course. Jovan Cvić was a very interesting figure. He was actually a geologist, geomorphologist, and anthropogeographer. So his interest in ethnology came from that side, and he was the founder of the first department of ethnology in 1906. Jovan Mirjanović is a little bit younger than him. He concentrated on the study of the Montenegrin tribes, on their origins, on their characteristics, division, and so on. Now, the first figure, Jovan Cvić, was an amazing figure. He, for example, traveled all through the Balkans. And basically, as a result, he produced in his major work called the Balkan Peninsula, which was first published in 1911 in French, and then somewhat later in Serbian. Among other things, incorporated such maps, which are, for example, holding the classification of the Balkan village types. Then he also had the classification of the Balkan house types. Then he also did make some kind of let's say, layering of this, what he called civilization zones in the Balkans, and so on and so on. So the state of affairs, to jump a little bit towards the further period, but covering also what happened in a way in the meantime, the state of affairs in the discipline by the early 1980s was ethnology. It could be said that ethnology reached its peak as an important national science between the two world wars. Ethnologists had a major role in defining the concept of the nation in the period of and after the Balkan Wars in the beginning of the 20th century, and the second after the First World War. After the establishment of socialist Yugoslavia in 1945, ethnology was degraded and placed under the patronage of other social sciences, such as history, sociology, and philosophy. In the 50s, in the period of between 50 and 74, ethnologists were studying the own as if they were others. The idea of the own in the national sense became blurred by the concept of us, both in the sense of a diffuse working class and, more importantly, in the sense of brotherhood and unity of the Yugoslav peoples. Ethnology started to bloom again, now with less ideological fragrance, while the local, let's say, intellectual traditions linked to the ideal of national science and were being slowly deserted, without new paradigms to replace them. Some authors label this period as the phase of empiricism. In the next period, up to the 80s, further liberalization of the Yugoslav society had its positive effects for ethnology in two major ways. First was the contact with foreign colleagues who were doing fieldwork in Yugoslavia, and those met during the increasingly frequent study trips of Yugoslav scholars abroad. And second, foreign books and reviews were imported, journals, were imported or translated in numbers unimaginable only a decade ago. However, the political elite became interested in the application of scientific knowledge in key sectors like economy or social welfare. Thus, sociology, economy, and philosophy gained new esteem vis-a-vis ethnology. Then, basically, you could say that I wanted to here portray a differentiation within the ethnological academic community in the 80s when I was a student and somewhat afterwards. In the whole post-war period, there were three major ethnological institutions, you should know that. The Department of Ethnology, where I studied, of the University of Belgrade, the Ethnographic Institute of the Academy of Sciences and Arts, which was founded after the war, with some previous institution close to it, and the Ethnographic Museum in Belgrade. There were likes and dislikes within the older generation faculty based on their educational background. For example, that is the leanings towards the Western ethnology vis-a-vis Eastern ethnography. On one side were the professors close to the Francophone traditions, and on those, and on the other, those more acquainted with the Slavic institutional networks. There was also a generational distinction, thus more or less readiness to accept new theoretical and methodological concepts, and as I found out recently, from the writing of my colleagues, because I don't write on that, ethnologies of those times were placed retrospectively in one of the two groups, namely this and the modernists. To be frank, just this is a footnote, I wouldn't be ready to write on the politics of any kind of ethnology, because I think it always suffers from simplifications. You never had this have this clear-cut division, but of course, because such publications are needed, as such texts are needed, I guess this is the best thing that could have been done with certain kind of classifications. So, the concepts in focus of the traditionalists were folk culture and tradition, people, peasantry, and ethnos or ethnicity, and the concepts in focus of the modernists varied. You could recognize here two generations. The first developed a liking for historical methods and worked towards interdisciplinary synthesis, like those offered by legal and historical anthropology or the studies of material culture. And the second were still using concepts like manifest and latent function, but were also rapidly developing a liking for keywords like structure, binary oppositions, process, strategy, or context. And in the battle between these two sides, structuralism and British reinventions of Van Gennep's Rite du Passage were to supply the main theoretical frameworks of the project that was intended to revolutionize ethnology in Serbia and directed towards the standards of Anglo-Saxon and French anthropology. This is what can be said in short. Now, I just wanted to show you how the structure of courses in the Department of Ethnology at that time looked like. I won't go through the whole thing, but the point is that the core ethnology courses comprise the study of three major cultural domains: material culture, social culture, and spiritual culture. And then each of these three domains was further subdivided into general, that is theoretical, and specific Yugoslav ethnography. Then we had some other courses. You can see from their titles how basically the whole thing was structured. We also had world ethnology, which was actually ethnography of different parts of the world, especially dealing with American Indian cultures. I chose just to mention it because I won't mention it again. At the end of my study, I chose to do a final BA thesis within this study of world ethnology, and I entitled it "The Divinatory Arts in Han Dynasty, China." So basically, I could do that much at that point of my education. Then a master's degree at Harvard. These are the typical pictures that you can usually see of this university. This is, again, a typical, and from my experience, very real image of Harvard Yard. These are the buildings in which I spent the most time. The one up was the Yanjing Institute and Library, which was the seat of the Far Eastern Languages and Civilizations. On the right is the William James Hall for Social Sciences and the Widener Library. This is Conant Hall, my second year dorm, which is very nearby, and this is how my room looked like. This is just, again, a small digression. It's funny, but, you know, I don't really have pictures from those times of my room, and actually very few pictures altogether, because we just didn't take pictures much. And so when I looked at internet, I found my hall presented in a very nice way, as it was then, probably looks the same now. And this room is exactly the same as mine, with some little details different. So basically I could, you know, this is a kind of a funny thing, because it provoked me, it brought back my memories and emotions in a real way, and yet I could have invented it all, you know. I just used somebody else's pictures. These are the areas of my concentration. The program I attended was very interesting, and I opted for it instead of for example, MA or PhD. PhD I wasn't ready for at that time, because I wasn't sure I wanted to live in the States for such a long time. So I opted for this Regional Studies East Asia program, which was interdisciplinary and which allowed me to take courses in anything I wanted. I had to have some Chinese language, history, and so on, but everything else was open. So this is where I tried to bring together my interest in China, anthropology, and urban life. So basically, I continued my Chinese classes. I even took some traditional Chinese or ancient Chinese, history of Chinese civilization and philosophy, sociology of Chinese modern society, city planning, and architectural design of China and Japan at Harvard and MIT, because we could cross-register, problems of urbanization in developing countries, in different things and all over the world. That was very interesting. Anthropology of development. And this was the title of my thesis, MA thesis, which I'll come back a little bit later on. As you can see, basically, out of all this and out of actually entering Chinese studies because of the liking for Chinese actually philosophy and history and culture, these things that you could imagine from afar about China, I ended up doing a thing for the thesis that was actually much closer to real politics of land and economics, and actually political economy. I just had to look for my former professors, which of course I didn't have the pictures of mine, so I just want to go through them because they also this illustrates what these classes that I took. So this is the program chair. This is my favorite professor, Robin Yates, who taught ancient Chinese civilization and Chinese ancient science. Benjamin Schwartz, a wonderful person who taught ancient Chinese political philosophy. So the young part of Chinese philosophy, not the yin. Ezra Vogel, a famous sociologist who wrote Japan #1, and after which the club of his followers was formed in Japan. Du Weiming, who is now one of the most prestigious Chinese philosophers, a Neo-Confucianist who founded this International Center of Advanced Study in Beijing. Then my MIT professors, who dealt with the infrastructure and with Chinese gardens, a graduation ceremony, and the thesis, the MA thesis. Let me just leave it. That I'm coming back to, because this is my first, let's say, real research that I've done, where I used the written sources, some interviews and so on, anything that I could get hold of while in Cambridge. So that was an interesting time, and I thought the topic was also interesting because I found a topic which actually nobody at the time recognized exists. The thing was that while studying the urban planning in developing countries, where I always concentrated on China and finding out about Chinese things in that domain, whether it's housing or, poverty or whatever. When we were doing land use, I discovered that actually there is no value of land in China, that it's almost not treated at all. And that it doesn't have the differential value. It doesn't have the land rent appropriated to it. Also, I was interested in the way of how the mechanisms, the state mechanisms, but also the informal gray economy mechanisms function in that domain, where the state actually held all the rights to ownership of land, and where the land use was differentiated in the city and in the countryside. In the city, it was state land and municipal land, and in the countryside, it could have been private as well, but it was mostly collectively owned. So I was wondering what's happening in the situations of urban reconstruction, or in the situations of construction of new houses in rural areas. So, in situations where you just had land at the edge of the cities, and I wanted to do it in 3 major and largest Chinese cities, which were also proclaimed as independent municipalities. That was Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. So the question was basically applied to, in general terms, is land occupied with the traditional temple of same value as the land occupied by commercial buildings, a golf course, or a swamp? Now, of course, these are the more recent pictures. At that time, you didn't have this golf course in Kunming, for example. I proceeded to study this topic later on until the 1990, let's say, or 92, because at the time I did the master's thesis, this was 1985, and I actually looked at what was going on until then, and the major things were happening in 1984, let's say, when some new legal ordinances and so on, legal documents were being brought about by the state. They started regulating these things, but also what I followed very closely, which was also something nobody really did at the time, was to follow the official debates that appeared in various newspapers, journals, but mainly kind of economic and political economic journals in China, in Chinese, but by their professionals dealing with land, who actually, my analysis showed, could have been, let's say, categorized in 3 groups. One was the Orthodox group, the Orthodox kind of approach to this whole thing. The second one was the liberal, and the third one was, let's say, pragmatic. They could all be measured by how much they actually were ready to make a step outward from the, Marxist, usual Marxist explanations and argumentation for keeping the status quo, as I described earlier. And so it was very interesting. I of course, had some help in translation of these texts, because my Chinese was not that good. There were many very economic terms, political terms, and so on. So I had the help of my Chinese teacher. I took individual classes with her, and also from my friends. One of them was Yashen Huang, for example, who is now a big star at MIT teaching economy of China and India. So I continued dealing with that afterwards as well, because new developments came, for example, in 1988, and actually the movement was towards this pragmatic approach, as you could expect, where they introduced the differential rent 1 and 2. I'm not going to go into that, but basically it's something that actually resembled what we have in capitalist economies. Now, I'm bringing forward this because this is an occasion which proved later on quite important for the history of Chinese modern anthropology. This was actually a small Congress. It ended up being relatively small, where actually the Urban Anthropology Commission of the Union, of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Associations, organized with the Chinese colleagues in Beijing. This was actually the occasion to modernize Chinese ethnography, because until then it was mainly dealing with ethnic minorities, but basically in a very pragmatic way. And there was obviously a group. The gentleman on the right, Ran Shihu, was the main person on the Chinese side, a member of the Chinese ethnologist in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and on the Western side were, for example, Aiden Salho, here sitting at a table, a well-known Africanist, urban anthropologist, Greg Goulding, who else? Peter Nass, who was very active then also in IUAS again, and so on. Now, this is a collective picture. You can see how big the conference is. But what's interesting is, and that I heard only now in Manchester a month ago, what all developed from all this. Basically, this conference gave life to the Commission of Urban Anthropology of China 2 years after. And then from that commission, they formed the Chinese Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences just before the big Congress in 2009 in Kunming. So actually here you have some young Chinese people, like the one on the far left, who is one of the major figures in Chinese institutional anthropology, Zhang Zhijiao, and who at that time was a young person, just kind of, in the shadow of these teachers of his who attended. Now, after that came some experience in the field and in, let's say, workshop in applied anthropology. This was a graduate seminar studio design in a historic city in Kyoto, organized by MIT and Kyoto University, mainly attended by urban design graduate students and two of us anthropologists. We were situated in Japanese families. This was a wonderful experience because we had different lectures from the university people, from people in the Urban Planning Commission and so on, and we also had the opportunity to see the hidden Kyoto, which of course these places most of you know of, but there are many others which are not so well known. The idea here was that we were trying to do this exercise, which was actually connected to a real happening in the city, and that is that there was to be urban redevelopment because there was a concept of this round, how you call it, circular city, circular inner road around, which was supposed to be finished in Kyoto. The fourth part of it was supposed to be built, which would actually break the whole traditional urban structure of Kyoto as an ancient capital, which you see here on the right-hand side. Nara is on the left, and here is Kyoto. These were the schemes from the 7th and 8th century, and which actually still was very much valuable and having influence of the daily and ritual life of the Kyoto residents, as you can see on the far right, because, for example, for the Gion Festival, all these communities centered around the city quarters were actually responsible for keeping the parts and then building the floats that participating in the huge elaborate ritual, but it also had to do a lot with these neighborhood networks, business going on around there and so on. So our homework was to divide in 4 groups. Of course, 2 of us work with all of them, and to try to come up with alternative proposals. So this is the Kamogawa River, where on one side you had Gion Shimbashi, the well-known, let's say, entertainment quarter, and the new buildings here, that was the place where in between there and the river was a tram track, and they were going to remove that and build a road. So what I could do was basically I studied the types of housing, the life in them. This is a typical up there, the typical Kyoto Machiya, the townhouse, and this down is a typical building, commercial and housing building in this area which was to be affected. So I did some interviews also with residents and the businessmen there with the help of a translator because I wasn't learning Japanese. And this is one of the project proposals, part of it that we made. Then afterwards followed the study trip in China. Right after Japan, a few of us from this same group that was in Japan, headed by our professor Gunther Nitschke from MIT, went to visit the old urban cores of Chinese cities to kind of observe the life and see what's going on. So these are the pictures from different cities like Kunming and Suzhou down with these gardens, and up there Guilin with the famous Lijiang River. But what was interesting, especially for me, and which was important for my later decision about the PhD thesis, was the observation of the life in the grid-structured cities of China, which were actually the old capitals, like Xi'an during the Tang Dynasty, and further somewhat, and Beijing, which of course is quite old as well, from Yuan Dynasty, at least a few centuries old. I won't go through all this. This is about reception of my work in East Asia. Basically, you know, I did some publications upon return to Serbia because I decided I was thinking about continuing, in a way, a PhD there, and I was invited by the MIT professors to do it there, but in the field of urban planning, because this is what I wanted to do. But in the end, I didn't do it. I decided I don't want to, as I said, to live in the States for such a long time. Also, I was offered a job in Belgrade by that time at the Department of what was called Ethnology and Anthropology by now, as an assistant, a teaching assistant, which at that time was a full-time post. And the South Chinese could have been taught only by a colleague who taught a world ethnology course. So basically, I could not really get a post where I could be also dealing with the educational part or teaching. And also, when I tried to do a PhD or to propose a PhD topic that dealt with China, even if I had to do a comparative study with Southeastern Europe, that ended up not being possible. Because of this old kind of structure and functioning at the university at that time, where basically you were to be tied to a professor who brought you to his or her course, which was also strictly determined, which was the material culture of Yugoslavia, and Dr. Petrovic, who was my professor, and to be advisor was dealing with historic anthropology and material culture of medieval Dubrovnik. So she saw no connection, and in the end, I basically had to give up doing the initial thing that I thought of doing, and that is the influence of urban structure on everyday life of the residents of Chinese and Japanese cities with orthogonal or grid structure. So yes, my family came along, and as I said, I got the employment, and after consultations with my advisor, I chose to do the old town of Dubrovnik as an alternative, which was also interesting because in the same city, I could find urban structure which had various degrees of regularity. I could find in the same city the structure which was highly regular and the one which was irregular. So my starting question was, does urban structure of the old city of Dubrovnik influence the spatial behavior of its inhabitants? And methodology-wise, I basically did both qualitative and quantitative approaches, a combination which I developed along as the process of research was going on, which was kind of strange, probably at that time in Serbian ethnology and anthropology. So I will show you a little bit of what I did. You can see here the structure in a way. So the two localities that I chose are Prijeko and St. Mary. You can see them here on the opposite sides of the town. What I wanted to see is how the urban structure, the physical structure, correlates with the social behavior and the social life. So I started from the neighborhood and went on to the larger, let's say, segments of the city. So I wanted to compare two types of, two ways of life in, on one hand, the street block in one, the more regular urban structure, and the St. Mary courtyard block in the irregular structure, which was actually situated, the courtyard block was situated, a few of them were situated in the former Catholic monastery. Then I also concentrated on spaces of everyday commercial, religious, and social gathering on the level of the whole city. And after doing surveys and interviews and so on, basically I was able to present the results of my study in these themes visually, where on the left you have the zones of socializing with friends. For example, this is just an example as part of a set of different kinds of socializing, where I could present differentially places occupied by the residents of the two locations, and on the right side you have the gathering space of St. Mary residents all together in different aspects of gathering. Then I also studied the ritualized behavior in the city, which was embodied in the daily promenade or the Corso, which you're probably acquainted with. And I concluded, my investigation actually gave such results that I could conclude that it's, first of all, a very interesting and very important informal institution, which on one hand reflects the social structure of the city, and on the other, that there is a very well-defined social segmentation of the Corso space. And third was the study of the ritual behavior during the festa of Saint Blaise, the saint protector of Dubrovnik residents and the city. And there was various occasions and a very complex ritual that they followed with the processions. And basically I tried to differentiate between the static and dynamic events in this whole celebration, and then presented again visually on this map where basically all the spaces occupied were captured, and then of course the interpretation of why this was happening and how urban structure determined all this was present in all these aspects of study. And the conclusion was actually that yes, the urban structure, varieties in urban structure did determine the spatial behavior of Dubrovnik residents, but it wasn't, but in different ways. And also somewhere with the absence of it, but on the other hand, that social characteristics of the population also matters. So the book came out sometime after I finished the thesis, because I couldn't deal with the whole thing emotionally because of the war in former Yugoslavia. I wasn't going to Dubrovnik anymore. I did the research, finished the research in the last moment in 1991, just before the borders closed. And basically, you know, it wasn't a place to go again for a researcher, because these bad feelings still persisted for a long time. And I didn't organize the book presentation, and I just, this tension towards the Serbs of either as regular visitors or as scientists was still present, and for quite a long time. So then I enter this last project that I want to present to you, the revival of traditional religious celebrations in the Bay of Kotor, Montenegro. So after basically making a break with the study of Dubrovnik, I thought what to do, and I didn't want to get too close to home. And on the other hand, I wanted to choose a place which was somewhat, let's say, similar or close in cultural aspects and geographic to Dubrovnik. There were other considerations. So why? The Bay had intellectual reasons, practical considerations, and irrational motives. So basically they were complex, but among the irrational motives was the beauty of the Bay of Kotor. This is the picture from the plane. This is the entrance into the bay. And these are the scenes that you can experience over there. Along the way in different situations. So my field work there started in the Luštica Peninsula. This is a view from the town of Herceg-Novi. At the entrance of the bay. This is an interesting place, exotized in a way in the narratives of the Herceg-Novi residents, because they were telling me how actually it's the people from Greece, from Albania, from all parts of Europe who had to disboard the ship because they had to stay in the quarantine, and how they're completely different mentality from themselves and so on. So I thought, well, maybe it's the time to enter the countryside part of the story and the investigation. So I went in 1986, and I actually went during the Christmas tide period, which is according to the Serbian Orthodox tradition, from January 6th, the Christmas Eve, until Saint Sava Day. This is an important saint in Serbian tradition, which is January 27th. And I stayed in this family and actually saw that the Christmas line of Yule logs is happening at the time when I was there, which was the Serbian Orthodox New Year, which is January 13th. And then I heard that they keep doing it quite a few times during the Christmas tide, from one time in that season to 7 times, according to the specific family traditions. These are the Yule logs, or the badnjaks, that they pick on the morning of Christmas Eve. They decorate them, and then this is the preparatory day. You know, they prepare all kinds of food. They go to the church to prepare it and to light the candles and so on. And then on the Christmas Eve itself, it's a big celebration with the ritual of the men carrying the Yule logs on their backs, on their shoulders, entering here with the oldest member lying them on the hearth, on the open hearth. They have a special small old kitchen, what they call, where they have the hearth, and the ritual of censing the table and eating special ritual food. So this was the introduction into Christmas Eve study and the study of traditional holidays. And then I heard about the celebration of the same holiday out in the public, in the city squares near the churches. And so I decided to go to Herceg-Novi in the following year, where I saw quite an elaborate festivity where the residents participated, where the priests were present and so on. And I decided to conceive a kind of a more serious study of this new, let's say, kind of celebration, which actually ended up being a revival of the old pre-war celebration, but which wasn't at that time equally represented everywhere and was performed by the army and not by the church and the people. And so I decided to do it in 2 urban localities in Herceg-Novi. I'm not sure that you can read it, but anyway, Herceg-Novi is here, and the town of Kotor all the way in that corner, and 2 rural parts, which are again Luštica, the same peninsula, and Grbelj on the other side. So just to show you some scenes from there, this is the town of Kotor, and this is the celebration there, which happens in the evening, with the representatives of the 2 Orthodox communities bringing their regional Yule logs at the open hearth, with the main priest putting them on the fire. And then this church part of the ceremony, which is very elaborate and elegant. This is the St. Nicholas Church in Kotor. And at that occasion, in 2008, the Metropolitan of Montenegro was present as well. This is again the countryside example in the region of Grbelj, where, as you can see, it looks different. It happens during the day, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the representatives of all 20 villages come with their badnjaks and the church flags, which are at the same time the Serbian national flags, and they walk in a procession up to the monastery, which is their main sacred place, now reconstructed partially, where after, again, a short ceremony, they come out onto the open hearth and light the village Yule logs. This study resulted in a book, which is called Christmas in the Bay of Kotor. It was published in 2008. As opposed to the book on Dubrovnik, this book was presented in the local communities as well as in Belgrade. I had a strong feeling that I need to and I want to present it among the local communities. So I made a presentation, not of course in the countryside part because that was very hard to organize, but I invited these people also to Herceg-Novi and to Kotor, where the presentations were organized in the summer of 2008. And on the other hand, if you want to talk about the reception of the book, otherwise in the academic community where I belong to in Belgrade, because this is a Serbian community, we have ethnology and anthropology only in Belgrade. Recently, it has been known as or drawn attention for its experimental character, as I said, because otherwise it wasn't really commented on, as far as I know. But the experimental comes from me trying to fit the contents of my research results into various forms or genres of writing. So, for example, this is the ethnography part, not the analytical or the historical part, but one of the 4 main chapters devoted to these locations was, for example, done as a drama, as a scenario for a drama. The other one was done as a ethnographer's diary, and so on. So, in summary of the mentioned research projects, I can say this. If my position was to be viewed in relationship to political and cultural contexts in which the subject of my study was to be found, the following could be observed. In case of China, it was the study of the other, through the eyes of the own, because my socialist experience in a way could relate to the Chinese communism. In case of Dubrovnik, it was the study of the own, which was very rapidly in the process of conducting research, becoming the other. In fact, in the summer of 1991, I was the only Serbian social scientist doing research in Dubrovnik, Croatia, where I was treated with much caution, provoking much notice, comments, and attention. In case of Montenegro, it was a study of the own, which in the process of disintegration of former Yugoslavia in the 2000s, of course it was a much slower process, remained, and without the war, remained the own, even though the state and the local government institutions became those of the other. I'm here referring to the local Christian Orthodox communities that consider themselves Serb in the process of distancing and finally separation of Montenegro from Serbia, while the new government institutions were forcefully implementing the old Montenegrin identity. The thing is that before these times, basically most of the Montenegrians thought themselves as both Montenegrin and Serbs. So, to go back to the offbeat thing, again, reminding that I don't want to be pretentious, but I try to force myself to see, after going through all these experiences, what it was that I did maybe differently from my colleagues or, yeah. So basically, if you go through this list, you could say that taking up the study of China along with doing research in Chinese language, very much unusual in Serbian academic context, which is still studying our own or nearby at most. Basically, of what I know, yeah, and I know the history and especially what my professors did. There was one professor, ethologist, who spent actually 2 years in China, in Beijing and Kunming. This was in the 50s. And he learned some Chinese. I don't know what else he was doing there, but upon return to Serbia, he wrote a book called The Chinese Customs, using Russian sources, you know. So this was the most that we could get. And, of course, as I said, my Chinese wasn't perfect, but at least I tried to do something, and I did something which was new even in the American context, because none of the American scholars did what I described I did at the time. Then, also, it could be said that I wasn't not being ideologically biased towards China, especially since it introduced its market economy by keeping its one-party communist system. Was again, I think, one amenity that I had and still have. And I think this is one of the reasons why I will try to do something again on China. Because, you know, especially since China started to advance economically, many Western scholars, especially from the US, just can't accept this progress, and they keep either foretelling that it will, you know, fall down like the next year or in the next month, or that actually it's not communism with the elements of market economy, but it's probably capitalism already, you know, with the disappearing communism. So this is, you can see all these things going around, and basically it's hard for them probably to accept that maybe the best solution for China is a one-party system, as it could have been for some other societies as well. Because from the Serbian experience, for example, and Yugoslav experience before with the one-party system and post-one-party system, which happened in 1990 with the new constitution, where the elections were multi-party. Now I sound like a real communist, right? That brought complete chaos. And now I'm talking about the party thing. Because now we have so many parties, and everything has turned into a party system. Everything is run by the party officials and the interests of the party and the interest of, you know, bringing the money into the party coffers, aside from individual personal interests, money-wise. So it's terrible. But China is a specific thing. It's very large. It was always ruled by the emperors. And basically, we cannot just equalize it with other systems and other states. But anyway, I got too much off. Then acknowledging the phenomena in the domain of Chinese studies that Western China scholars did not notice as important, but which also seemed more in domain of political economy than anthropology. Actually, I already mentioned that. Applying a multidisciplinary approach in the study of the city. This I'm referring to Dubrovnik, but still trying to keep a holistic view. So my colleagues, probably disciplinary colleagues, probably thought of it as too sociological and not really mainstream anthropological in a sense of what they called modern anthropology in Serbia. Because, you know, a short article, for example, a review article on development of urban anthropology of Serbia was written, and this work was not mentioned, while many other short, invaluable articles were. But anyway, then applying a combination of quantitative and qualitative research methods was really offbeat, because quantitative methods are not applied at all in Serbian anthropology, or are applied in rudimentary form with no understanding of its logic, really. No real understanding and knowledge of statistics, you know, quantitative methods, analysis, and so on. We didn't have a class in it. We just had qualitative ethnology, but I had to learn it by myself, running around and capturing the attention of quite a few sociologists, psychologists, methodologists, statisticians, and so on. And I also learned just the basic methodology, but at least it was from the beginning to the end. Then being primarily concerned with studying the results of social processes and phenomena and coming to conclusions about their commonalities and the specificities, as opposed to being engaged in interpretations only. Maybe here I'm not so clear, but basically this comes from me always insisting on fieldwork. Because nowadays in Serbian ethnology you have very little fieldwork, because it's easier that way. You know, some are doing fieldwork on internet, but a lot of it is actually finding themes which are interesting, but can be done by reading, newspapers, looking at TV, analyzing films, dealing with some theoretical concepts out of blue, and so on. Then moving from a disciplined and positivist research approach to a softer and fluid one, plus experimenting with the genres or forms of text in order to find the most appropriate fitting for the ethnographic data collected in the field. This I felt just a need to do. This is maybe the artistic part of me, and also kind of more relaxed approach to anthropology with time. And in the end, worrying about the actors of my research as to whether they will be able to read the texts and how they will be presented in them. This was a large concern to me, and of course I assume to many of you, but it isn't the case always in Serbian ethnology and anthropology. Now, what I did last was a book called Methodology of Anthropological Fieldwork, from Normative to Experiential. It just came out, and I'm not going to talk about it, but basically it will be interesting to see whether it's going to provoke any kind of reaction, because in it I promoted among other things that we should teach students, and that ethnologists and anthropologists in Serbia should, for example, know both methods, both approaches, qualitative and quantitative, and apply them appropriately. It shouldn't be a must, but they should know both. And I incorporated a lot of my research experience, so it's kind of a retrospective of my work, but also kind of a normative thing, because we never had a book written on methodology by one author. There was one collection or two collection of articles, but not a book. So we'll see what happens. I'm ending. I'm sorry, I don't know how much time I took, but there is 2 more slides. Now, since I want to go back a little bit to what we started with and what Robert was announcing and so on, about the status of anthropology in present-day Serbia. I should say that the prospects of anthropology today becoming important in the Serbian society are very grim. On one hand, anthropologists have not been bold enough to address the crucial social, cultural, and political questions. For example, they had withdrawn from studying the consequences of civil war in former Yugoslavia, same as they are now pretending that Serbia is not in deep systemic crisis. Liberal capitalism has its hold in Serbia, got hold in Serbia with all its negative consequences, and among them is tightening the budget for social sciences. Anthropology is marginalized equally as the other social sciences. There is no funding for fieldwork, we hardly manage to publish the journals, and get a small portion of what is needed to attend conferences abroad. Then, on the other hand, anthropology is vibrant. Many young PhD students have been brought into the projects of the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology, which is another institution kind of connected to the department, but they mostly work on, as I said, theoretical topics or use written and electronic sources at most. The journals provide space for publishing which satisfies the upgrading of individual careers and survival of the present anthropological community, but in fact does not stimulate true opening up towards the international community. Also because of the the change of rules for advancement, for academic advancement. Nowadays, every few years, or even more often, people are completely confused what they should do in order to advance. So this is kind of the strategy of survival. Basically, you form your own journals, you make them strong in the context of list of journals on the national level and how they are accepted and evaluated, and then you publish in them, because that's where you get your points. And yet, on the other hand, it's closing ethnology because the discipline towards the international context, because you don't have time to devote to do and to go elsewhere. Also, participation in international conferences is not valued at all. So basically, people don't go for that reason. This, for example, that few of us are doing is kind of strange, not needed. Members of the anthropological community have been waging a war against the establishment, which imposes purely quantitative criteria imported from the West for evaluation of scientific production. This has been very much so present in the past few years. And then anthropologists have not opened gateways for wider employment of their students, including possible teaching engagement in the elementary or secondary schools. I guess this is not singular to our ethnology. This war should be waged further, right? As we have also mentioned in WCAA. And in the end, Where is the place of Serbian ethnology within the international center-periphery power relations? If you look at its status from the political point of view, it is definitely at the periphery, and there is no prospect for change in the near future. And this status is unavoidable because the strength of the national anthropology seems to be in accord with the strength of the states they come from. Then, what seems to be promising, on the other hand, is the spread of the new view of anthropologies internationally, which is embodied in the movement called World Anthropologies. And this view considers loosening and thus weakening the Anglo-American hegemony in anthropology and giving more voice to all the existing anthropological communities that now seem equally marginal. Thus, the recipe for the young generation of anthropologists in Serbia, Portugal, Spain, Brazil, China, Uganda, New Zealand, Russia, anywhere, is to work on two tracks for the time being. On one hand, to contribute to the growth of the discipline in the national context, and on the other, to present their research and develop networks in the surrounding hegemonic context, be it global, continental, or regional. That's it. Okay, so I can sit.
Well, thank you very much, Vesna. That was a very interesting presentation, very original in its structure, which has in fact raised a very large number of questions on the kind of issues that we've been focusing on here. Does anybody want to ask Vesna any questions to start off with, or shall I? Are there any questions? Christiana. We need the peripatetic microphone.
Thank you, Vesna. This was extremely, really interesting as a food for thought, as a comparison, as a particular case, in many, many senses. And I have many questions, but I'm concentrating on one that is probably shared by other people in the audience, which is during the civil wars, was there any role of those rising traditions that made emphasize the collectivity of some identities? Mm-hmm. Was anthropology used in any sense to strengthen issues that were about making one group be more legitimate than others in certain claims? And do you see any similarities between I see some maybe parallel in what were the after colonialism inability to address certain issues and the coming of those issues as like the one issue many people want to talk like 20 years after or something. Do you see any similarity with that sort of collective trauma or remaining lingering issues and other issues that were also silenced and then came again as subjects of anthropology?
You mean also related to the first question about the period of the Civil War? Yeah, I'll just answer right away. Yes, that's a good question. I just didn't have the time and space to mention all these periods, but yes, this time of the Civil War was very important. Basically, no. Largely saying, ethnologists and anthropologists in Serbia did not really stand in defense of the nation, the Serbian nation in that war. There were of course some who did have these stands. I mean, and I know this from, let's say, more private conversations, but they were not really loud. They didn't want to express them, in the form of discussion or articles that would have this component in it. Anthropologists were not involved almost at all. What you could hear, the one side one part of them being louder, and this is the anti-nationalist side, or the cosmopolitan, kind of side, which tried to actually criticize what's going on concerning Milosevic, and his government and so on. But that was done in a roundabout way. It wasn't the point of the subject matter. So basically, and on the other hand, as I said, we didn't study, let's say, the consequences of war migrations. Like 500,000 people came from Bosnia and Herzegovina to Serbia at that point. That was not studied. Things like that. Whereas, for example, in Croatia, it was the opposite. The whole anthropological community stood in defense of their country, identity, whatever was happening to them. They were, continuously writing on migration, on return migrants, on suffering from the war, and so on. So, it was a quiet time. It was a quiet time, and I think that wasn't good. It wasn't positive. Just to be short.
Any more questions? Pleasure. Language-wise, what's the picture?
What did you say first?
Language-wise, and what's the picture?
In what sense?
In terms of production.
In what languages? Yes. In what languages? Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, until maybe a few years back, basically most of the anthropologists published in Serbian. In Serbian journals. Some of them who knew well enough, for example, German or French, did some publishing in their journals. But generally, there wasn't too much publishing, how to say, because nobody really counted your points, pressed you to do this number and that number of articles, was looking where you're publishing. So it was like, you could decide what to do about it. Let me see. Yes, and then some colleagues also some of us published in English. But not only in English. The predominant language was Serbian. Now, lately, what is being done is that in our journals, which we have 3 of actually around the department, and then some others, but these are the major ones, now more and more people publish in English, in them, which is kind of funny because on one hand, who's going to read issues in ethnology and anthropology, but on the other hand, they're open access, so basically they're reachable, and with good marketing and, through World Anthropology Networks, it is possible that more and more people would read it. And but this also has to do with the politics of journal publishing in Serbia and financing, because if you have a journal which is called designated as international journal or journal of international importance, then you have both the local and the international board, and then you are supposed to publish more in other languages. So it's possible also to publish in French and German, for example, in some of them, but mainly English. So it's kind of a funny situation right now. What's going to happen? Are we going to be read by writing in English in our national journal? Yeah.
Carmen?
Sorry, I don't know how to do a short question as my colleague did. It will be a little longer than I wish to. It's very rare to talk with someone who studied in Harvard and went to China to do field work. So I'm curious, I would like to hear from you about the Chinese anthropology. Because you skipped one Congress, very important, in 2000. You showed us a picture of the Congress of the U.S., the Inter-Congress, in 1990. But in 2000 in Beijing, there was a huge Congress The opening was in the Central Library of Beijing by the highest authorities of the country. I was very impressed. And it was my first contact with the Chinese anthropology. And I presented a paper in a large room full of Chinese anthropologists who was just looking very seriously and silently. And my paper was about football. Everybody comments on football. No matter where you present. After I finished, silence in the room. Rapidly, I was happy because I have some Dutch colleagues on the room who made some questions. But my second experience was in Kunming. You showed us. I saw a big transformation. And the third experience was recently in the U.S. Congress that we were in U.S. in Manchester, no? And there I was participating in a panel that
I was listening to this panel.
Was completely different. They were talking like world anthropologists. It wasn't that respect to the authority, this minority discourse that not critical at all of anything in China. No, they were just anthropologists talking about anthropology. So I'd like to give us a comment on what your view about the transformation of the Chinese anthropology, or if I'm just dreaming.
Well, I really don't know much about it because I wasn't following it. I'm sorry I didn't mention, I couldn't mention all the important conferences in China because, I didn't know much about, I think the one you're referring to in 2000 was again on urban anthropology, right? Yeah, I was supposed to go there. I was invited, but for some reason I couldn't go. But anyway, I was telling only of the occasions that I was involved in. This is just a comment on that. But otherwise, I really wasn't following much what's going on there. I was completely out of it. I recently started getting interested in, for example, I wrote an article after coming back from Kunming, 20 years after, Beijing and Kunming, because I was in both cities like 20 years before that. And of course, in those 12 days I was in China in 2009, I couldn't see everything, but I commented on what I could see in the public space, concrete physical public space, what was going on, what changed, what changed in the experiences of it. So, China is definitely worth studying. So, are you thinking of doing the same or doing something in China? No. Okay.
Vesna, thank you for a fascinating, although long and demanding. It was demanding on the listeners. I have a question of curiosity. In your studies of Chinese civilization and language, either in Harvard or elsewhere, did you ever work with the 24-volume collection edited by Joseph Needham called Science and Civilization in China? And what was the status of that collection of books when you were doing your course? Because there is lately a renewed interest in Needham's collection by a series of people working on Eurasia and conceptions of Europe, India, Southeast Asia, and China as one sole continent. So when I studied a little bit of Chinese civilization in Columbia in the 1970s in New York, it was only called Chinese civilization. And Needham was not even cited. So I'm interested if in the 80s or later on, Needham's book was given another kind of status.
Well, in fact, I started off by reading Needham when I was doing this, even in undergraduate studies, this thing on Chinese calendrics, and it's a proto-science, right? And so actually we had his volumes in our university library. So I took it from there and I read it. But okay, this is my own thing. But then later at Harvard, I remember that my advisor, Robin Yates, the British guy, who was actually specializing in Chinese ancient science, was involved. And maybe we are now talking about the same project, but they were actually making a whole series, I guess, of books kind of revisiting Needham on Chinese science. But I don't know what later got on. And then I also know about this whole concept of Euro-Asia, which, for example, is being pretty much implemented in Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology in Sala and so on by Chris Hahn and so on, right? There are some others as well.
Any more questions?
I think everybody's tired.
I should like once again to thank Vesna very much for a fascinating account, both in terms of personal trajectory and in terms of the varying contexts within which she has worked. I think she has illustrated very nicely the way in which anthropology is not a homogeneous discipline and the kind of tensions that exist within it. Thinking in terms of her own return to Serbian to Serbian anthropology, for personal reasons, you decided to study China. You studied Chinese land use. You returned to Belgrade wanting to do the same thing, and you were told you can do it, but only if it's on a Serbian subject. And so you did this on Dubrovnik.
Yeah.
And then, even so, you produced the book, and it was passed over in silence by people in your university, and you have now ended up, I'm not saying this depreciatively, but you have now ended up working on subjects which would have been perfectly at home in traditional Serbian anthropology. In one way, looking at it very cynically, one could say that it has been a process of the taming of Vesna, who went away, she worked on China, but she has now been domesticated because she is working on Yule logs, on the type of topics that would have fitted perfectly within traditional Serbian ethnography. Even if your methods are new, they bring in all your background experience and everything else. My last question, if I may, is simply to ask you whether you think Serbian anthropology is really still characterized by its traditional concern with popular cultures, identity, nationality, and whether you think this is a long-standing structure, or whether there is hope of an opening up of Serbian anthropology, similar to what has taken place in Brazil, for example. Trajano is here, he's a Brazilian anthropologist. Brazilian anthropologists always worked on Brazil, but Trajano has been working on West Africa for 20 years or more. Is there an opening up of Serbian anthropology, or is there simply a modernization of a Serbian tradition?
When you say open it up, okay, you think in terms of theory and as well as going out and doing other field works outside?
Both.
Yeah, both. Well, in the first sense, you cannot say that it's really traditional. Actually, my colleagues are thinking that they are doing actually very modern and anti-traditional anthropology. You know, I didn't have time now to go into what they're doing right now, unfortunately. But some of them are, keeping to the kind of folk culture, but in a different way, kind of modern way, like analyzing these folkloristic events which Serbia is full of. For example, the fairs of let's say, different products, agricultural products.
So in one way you're saying the topics may be the same or similar, but the questions are different.
The questions are different, but the topics are also different. Some do completely different topics. Yeah. On the other hand, yeah, the prospects of getting out of Serbia and the surroundings and doing research on other continents is grim. There is no money, and there is no support, intellectual support for that. Yeah.
That's sad.
So it's a small ethnology.
Thank you very much.